Now, here are Morgan Streetman and Roxanne Wilder.
I'm going to start a rumor. Morgan is leaving us for a national program. What do we always say on this show? If you say it often enough, people believe it.
That's
and
right.
It becomes
a
true.
lie told often enough becomes
Well, it's
true.
long overdue.
I love it. I love it.
Morgan is, he made his debut this weekend. Was it this weekend?
It was
Couple days
actually
ago.
just last night.
Last night on the Dr. Drew show. He called in.
Do you remember Dr. Drew and Adam Carolla and what was the name of the show that they had back in the 90s?
Love
Line?
Love Line, yes.
Yeah.
And
Well, anyway, if you are old enough to remember that,
he's a great broadcaster.
Do you have audio of this?
there is. I sent you the link. You could get to it on Periscope.
Okay.
But I don't have it handy. I mean, other than I sent it to your BBGI email.
Oh, okay.
So
Well,
which
I'm
you
gonna
never
go look
log
at that.
into appropriately
Well,
while
I do.
at work.
I'll get there about
You
Wednesday.
can only try him on his personal email.
I have done that also, but check your BBGI right
will
now,
do
and you
that.
can find it. It's about 50 minutes and 30 seconds into the
And I'm sending
show.
it to you as well, Pat.
Yeah.
So now you've got two. I tried to send it to you right where the call-in hit. So
Simona Mangiante Papadopoulos, George Papadopoulos' wife, Italian wife. Remember, she was at one point accused by a lot of people of being some kind of a Russian asset, because she has an accent, see, and so she must be a Russian. But in any event,
She's
she
beautiful.
was. Oh, isn't she gorgeous?
Gorgeous lady.
I'll tell you what, things worked out all right for Georgie boy. I'll tell you what, he did all right. I mean, he had to do, 10 or 11 days in the slammer, which was totally bogus, by the way, because, the FBI caught him off guard. They asked him if they could interview him, and they didn't mention to him that he ought to probably have a lawyer present or anything else. And they really just said they wanted to talk to him. So they flew up to Chicago and had a couple of FBI agents sit down with him. And then he misremembered talking to somebody. I think it was Joseph Mifsud that he misremembered exactly when he had spoken to him. And from that, you get, of course, well, you've lied to the FBI. Meanwhile, guys like Andrew McCabe, who are professionals who know about the rules, know exactly what they're dealing with when they're under investigation. Andrew McCabe lied to the FBI multiple times. And it was when they confronted him with the actual evidence of what he did that he said, oh, well, maybe he must have misremembered or something. And they said, well, you know what he did? He lacked candor. And so we'll just demote him. We won't actually do anything to him, though. But guys like George Papadopoulos, folks like you and me, normal people, you misremember something when you're talking to the FBI, and bam, you're going to the slammer. Period, the end. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. So anyway, Simona Mangiante Papadopoulos was on last night with Dr. Drew on his show, and it was funny because they were doing kind of a mix of calls, and Dr. Drew is an addiction expert. He's a doctor, and he knows a lot of things about addiction. Did you find it, Pat George?
I do have it.
Okay.
You want to hear it?
Yes, I do.
You want to play it? Go for it. Play it. Now, you can hear it in real time. You don't have to listen to my retelling of it.
Morgan Streetman. Yeah, I'm actually in Tampa, Florida.
His
But I
question
was
about
calling
Professor.
about somebody
Yes.
in Cambridge.
Yes.
And I first wanted to say this is really for Simona. Thanks for having me, Dr. Drew. I've loved following your husband's story. I've read his book, Deep State Target. Love watching you guys on Twitter.
Thank you.
Love your swimwear line.
Thank you.
And so my question for tonight, obviously I'm a big fan of y'all's, but my question is, can you tell us what you think is going to happen with Stefan Halper, and particularly with respect to the upcoming impeachment hearings and also the Inspector General's report, and then maybe the criminal investigation? And maybe for the audience's benefit, you can tell a little bit about who Stefan Halper is, but
Yes.
I'm really curious to know what you think is going to happen to him at this point as
Great.
part of this whole story.
Thank you, Morgan.
Thank you, Morgan. So for the audience, I start to give a little brief
Background,
about who Stephen Halper. Stephen Halper is this Cambridge professor who set George up at the time, inviting him to London.
Wait,
and
Miss Food?
no, this is Halper is another one.
Okay.
So it's
your other Russian colleague.
Yes, Halper. That's my other colleague. No, actually, I'm mad at Stephen Halper because he sent to George a really seductive honeypot. So I felt sort of competition.
I see. I understand.
You know?
Wow.
Azaraturk, this
yeah?
blonde bombshell. They said,
to try
to seduce him and say, George, it's so sexy to have, if you do some business with Russia, I'm going to sleep with you if you tell me everything about it. And
who was she working for?
She was working for the CIA. And she, of course, it was a fake name. And she was the supporting role of the fat spy, less attractive. Stephen Halper is not that attractive, if you see his picture.
Not to George, anyway.
No. So I'm mad at him. I'm mad at all of them.
Reasonable?
Yeah, exactly. To come back to the real, the real, this is real too, but the impact of what happened is that we know that Halper has been paid by the FBI. So there is a track, this character has been outed to participate to this scheme of entrapment. Azaraturk, the blonde bombshell, blah, 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 she disappeared. We know today this is not a real name. The phone number that at the time she provided doesn't exist. We're just talking about this person that was seductive and then vanished. So I'm the only spy who stayed.
Well, will there be will this come up in the impeachment process?
Yeah,
do you think?
I think it's what's so scary about this process is that we are all this information, all these facts happen to infiltrate the Trump campaign with different characters. So Mifsud is the first one who approached George to throw the bomb of the dirt on Hillary Clinton, and the second professor was trying to extort to George by himself and through these honeypots some information about collusion with Russia. The reality is that this never happened. George not even reported this information to the campaign at the time. That's the reason why it was not caught in anything major than misremembered date. Otherwise, a conspiracy would have materialized. That's Halper, to go back to your question, is one of the central character because we know he not only invited George to London to work, he was asked to do this paperwork on oil policies, but also Mike Flynn. So there are another Trump campaigner that was approached by the same professor who seemed very interested in all the people working for the campaign of the current president. I think definitely all these characters didn't operate individually. They were all participating to the same scheme, which is the one to, that is, as you said, you read the George book and explains very well what happened. So definitely is part of the new investigation, the Dura investigation, and I'm happy that the new information that came out translated into a new criminal investigation, which is very important.
This is the current DOJ investigation.
Yes, which is very important because it was a bunch of fluff. They would die on the path.
There you go, Morgan.
All right. Thank you all so much. It was great to hear from you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, man. Let me get some.
Wasn't that fun?
You sounded like their correspondent, the way that
Yes.
you asked the question.
Yes.
Brought them to
It was
the
probably the
subject.
best question in that hour and a half show.
I have to say, I listened to the rest of it. It's, Dr. Drew's an addiction specialist, so you get a lot of people calling up with addiction issues.
Sure, variety of a crowd.
And they are, let's just say they're interesting callers. I feel really bad for those people. I mean, there were several people who were both addicted to legal drugs, so antidepressants, and trying to come off of those and some of the sort of feelings that they were having when they were trying to come off of those. And then you also had several people addicted to things like methamphetamine and crack cocaine and other illegal drugs, and just some of the havoc that's created in their lives. One lady was homeless out of Austin, and You just listen to these stories and you just think, wow, it's amazing how uncomfortable people are with just being themselves.
Mm-hmm. And what an epidemic it is. How many different types of people from all walks of life face those kinds of addiction problems.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I mentioned the IG report. That's supposed to be coming out today, but of course it wouldn't be out in time for the show. And even if it was out in time for the show at weighing in and I think 600 plus pages I've heard, we wouldn't have time to analyze it for you. And of course, what most people will do probably is just read the headline and or read the executive summary, the conclusion at the beginning, which, if experience is any guide, could well turn out to be a whitewash of the details of what's in the actual report. And that's typically the way these IG reports have come out. They've got a lot of details of wrongdoing, but at the end of the day, we didn't find any actual intent. There was no broad-ranging conspiracy here. Now, let's hope he does a better job of it with this one, but that'll be out about 1 p.m. today.
We're back on the Morgan Streetman Show, and we had so much fun going through your call with Dr. Drew, a great correspondent to his show, Morgan. And so we didn't even get into our quick look back segments or a local interest story, but we've got some things to share with you in that under those categories.
Well, it's pretty interesting what happened last week at NAS Pensacola, where we had this person who was here who was a Saudi national who was studying to be a pilot, Mohammed Al-Shamrani. And he apparently had a Glock 9mm that he'd acquired legally somehow. We don't know exactly what the way that was, but he apparently bought it legally. I guess maybe he had a hunting permit. I understand if you've got a hunting permit, even if you're a foreign national, maybe you can buy a gun, something like that. Don't know the exact details because a lot of the news is still coming out about this. And, of course, it's being spun. There's no doubt about it's being spun. In fact, it's hard to even find his name mentioned in a lot of the news stories, Mohammed Al-Shamrani, although they do mention the names of the victims as much as they can. But it's hard to find the name of the perpetrator. But apparently he was not alone. There were several. First of all, he had a dinner party the night before, and he had people over, and they watched mass shooting videos, I guess, to get into the mood. I mean, what in the world kind of a dinner party is that? That's one you don't want to be invited to for sure. And then there were a couple of guys who were apparently caught filming the shooting itself, I guess for distribution on social media. They say there was a whole group operating through social media. But what we're hearing from authorities now throughout the state of Florida, Governor DeSantis included, is that there are others who are part of this cell. Now, nationally, nobody's really wanted to come out and call it terror, although it's hard to imagine what else this was, right? Pat, you're laughing at that. I mean,
what else could it be?
Exactly. I mean, but, we live in this strange world where we don't say things that are true because we're all scared to death of this political correctness regime that governs our lives. You might say something that's true, and if it's not accepted by the regime that governs your life, you could find yourself out of a job. You could find yourself the victim of a social media campaign against you. And we all know people who that's happened to, who've just spoken things that to them were the truth. They didn't mean any offense by it. They're just trying to tell the truth, and they've been attacked for it.
Well, we brought this up on the show this morning, Beyond the Law, that it was on his Facebook. And I said, why didn't somebody turn him in? But apparently it wasn't on there long enough for anybody to gain any traction to say, hey, look at this guy.
And it's interesting, too, how you say we live in such a funny world where we're afraid to label or categorize certain things or speak the truth. And in addition to that, we live in a world where people try to spin opposites as the truth. Oh, it's daylight outside. No, Roxanne, it's dark right now,
right.
Where they try to confuse you with opposites. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, they gaslight you on all this stuff.
Yes.
Try to tell you that things are that really aren't.
Words are powerful. And it's just a strange day and age to have to live and try to sift through all of this. But we do want to bring up this hero who was killed in Friday's attack at the Naval Air Station in Pensacola. He was local, 19-year-old Mohammed Sama Hathaim, and he was one of the 3 sailors killed. And just what a tragedy. 19 years old, St. Pete native, and people who knew him at Lakewood High School said they're not surprised at all that this went down the way that it did because he was trying to save other people, and he was a true hero.
Yeah, so not all the Muslims are bad, certainly, and I don't think anybody's saying that, but at the same time, there's nothing wrong with calling a terror attack, and yeah, it was done by a Muslim who was a Saudi national who apparently had a great degree of hatred for the United States, which he professed to people who would listen to him. You know, the other interesting thing is that apparently there are other members of this cell who are still out there, and they're looking for them. Now, they haven't told us, the public, who they're looking for, or given us pictures who we ought to be looking for, but apparently these people are running loose in the state of Florida. So we'll see if there's more news on that yet to develop.
And I talked to my son, who's at Lackland, and he said, we have lots of Saudis that are learning to be pilots. It's a very normal thing.
Sure. Well, and Roxanne, you and I were talking before the show how we train.
A family member was telling me who is a pilot, yes, that trains Saudis. And all foreign countries, for that matter. We train a lot of foreign countries here in terms of pilots.
Yeah, we have the best technology, the best training for airline pilots in essentially the whole world. So a lot of countries are sending their people over to the United States to learn to be pilots. I mean, as air travel, becomes a global phenomenon in places like China, air travel's on the rise big time, as the president might say. Then they're going to need more pilots. And heck, we've already got a pilot shortage here in the U.S. So how do you think they're doing in the rest of the world where they don't have as much of a built-in experience with having a long-term, airline industry operating in their country? So, I want to point out one last thing about this terror attack at NES Pensacola, because I think this is worth noting. And it kind of reminds me, if you remember the Aurora Theater shooting in Colorado all those years ago. The person who performed that shooting picked a theater that was a gun-free zone. So the theater itself said, patrons, you're not allowed to bring your firearms into this zone. It's kind of like, you see this a lot of places now. Schools, obviously, federal buildings, other places, national parks are gun-free zones. Well, guess what? NES Pensacola is like a gun-free zone, which is kind of hard to believe. It's a military base, but they actually don't want anybody on base who's armed. And it just makes you wonder, do you think that might have some effect on where these criminals, these terrorists, whatever they may be, are choosing to conduct their attacks? If you were choosing to conduct an attack, would you want to attack someplace with some folks who are well armed? Would you want to take on a military base where they had MPs, where they had people who were armed, ready to guard it, like say MacDill? I don't think so. You're gonna be toast if you attack MacDill. But like NAS Pensacola, where they're gun free, so no bad things can happen here, right? Well, then look what happens. And nobody's got a gun to try to stop the bad guys. So just wanted to point that out. Now, speaking of guns...
And there will be a lot more to come on this.
Oh, well, I think we're going to see this develop. We've got to see what happens over the following days. There are probably going to be more arrests. I'm sure they're searching for people. Now, with the technology today, they've got very sophisticated tracking technology for phones and other things. So in theory, if they know essentially who these people are and they have social media profiles, they probably are going to be able to find them relatively quickly. Now, we'll see. Obviously, people sometimes who do this know how to make themselves harder to find by ditching their phones and things like that. And we don't want to get into too much detail of how you'd make yourself harder to find, but there are people that know how to do that. And maybe if you're preparing to do something like this, you go and study up on that so that you've got a little bit more room to run. But by and large, they're probably going to have a hard time avoiding that contact, which is going to then draw them into the web of law enforcement when they make contact either with social media accounts or other people that know them who are known to know them based on communications that have occurred before.
But whatever you do, don't profile.
Yeah, right. Well, you can't do that, Pat George. That would be, don't do what the Israelis do because they don't know how to handle terror attacks. A lot of people don't remember the Intifada back in the early 2000s that occurred where they were blowing up buses in Israel just all the time. I think it was at least one a week for a long period of time. And by the way, with a country as small as Israel, those bus attacks were essentially equivalent relative to the population of something like 9/11 happening week after week after week as they would blow up these buses with 50 and 60 people on them. So, the Israelis are the model for how to deal with terror, and we ought to follow their model, and their model is profile. Look into history, psychological profiles, everything else. I've never flown on El Al, but I understand you go through a questioning process. I mean, they don't just let you get on El Al and come to Israel. You have to be evaluated. And, that's just the world that we're living in now, where this terror is ever present. So, to me, it makes perfect sense. And maybe to you, it makes perfect sense as well. But, of course, we're told by the politically correct regime that governs us that we cannot think that way. That's bad. That's evil, Pat George. I can't even believe you suggested that, right?
You know who else profiles is Italy.
Does Italy profile?
Mm-hmm. Big time.
Well, it works. It works. And so, maybe we need to do the same. But in any event, wanted to talk a little bit. I was going to say, speaking of kind of holding guns to people's heads, I mean, this stuff that's going on in Congress right now. And I mean, does anybody else find it highly offensive that last week, while the president was over meeting with NATO, this sacred alliance that the Democrats and Republicans all talk about, that they say President Trump is going to destroy this important and sacred alliance. And I'm not denigrating NATO in any way, but they build it up to be such an important alliance, as though we couldn't survive without NATO, which is actually not true. NATO is basically us providing for the defense of all of Europe. That's what NATO is. And that's what President Trump's trying to change. But while he's over there meeting with them, we've got the Congress over here conducting hearings on impeaching him. In other words, while he's abroad trying to conduct foreign policy, his own people back home are undermining him directly. Now, how do you think that makes it for him to try to conduct foreign policy? You think that makes it harder or easier for him to conduct foreign policy when the Congress is saying they want to remove him as president? I mean, think about that. The disloyalty is shocking.
Welcome back to the Morgan Streetman Show. And the discussions that we have on air just turn into even deeper discussions off air. So if you think we're crazy on air with conspiracy theories and directions that we go, wait until you hear the off air.
That's right. Hopefully nobody's recording the off air conversations for further use one day. And if you want to get on the horn with us today, give us a call at 888-404-1010, and we'll be happy to put you on. We do have a few more things we wanted to try to get to, though, and I don't know that we'll make it through all of them, but we certainly had some very interesting stuff on the Ukraine, on Joe Biden and his son Hunter's involvement there. We want to try to get to that. Before we turn to that page, though, I don't know if you saw it last week, but Adam Schiff came out with some telephone records that apparently he got, and we're not sure exactly how he got them, but the thought is maybe just the Intelligence Committee subpoenaed them from AT&T or other phone providers, and somehow those phone providers gave them to them. But he's come out with these telephone records that basically show calls made to and from Congressman Devin Nunes, calls made to and from the White House. And, I mean, it's pretty shocking. I mean, it's a bit of a below-the-belt type of an attack even for Adam Schiff, who is known for that type of thing. But to go after Devin Nunes by showing, well, he called Rudy Giuliani. Well, as Devin Nunes said, of course he called Rudy Giuliani, and Rudy Giuliani called him. He said, anybody who's a well-known congressman has had conversations with Rudy Giuliani. He's always on the phone with us, telling us various things, that are important to him and things like that. And I mean, that's what you do. We've gotten to this world where somehow the media is totally complicit in this. I mean, they're totally complicit. But folks, hopefully you see right through this, and that is the idea that you can't talk to anybody, right? You can't talk to anybody. Oh my God, President Trump sat with Vladimir Putin in a room together, and we don't know what they said. I mean, okay. I mean, he's the president. That's what he's supposed to do. We have to talk to both our allies, and we also have to talk to our enemies. Dialogue is a good thing. Hopefully, dialogue puts off bullets flying, right? I mean, the point is, there's nothing wrong with talking to somebody. It doesn't mean you agree with them.
Dialogue and diplomacy go hand in hand.
Sure.
I would imagine. And again, I think conversations can be private. Some of them that are appropriately. I know that government conversations and certain things have to be on the up and up, but there's some things that I don't want people to know that you and I just talked about on air, you know? So everybody has pockets of their duties that need to have some sort of level of confidentiality.
There's absolutely nothing wrong with privacy, even though, again, this regime that seems to be controlling our thoughts now and controlling our lives and controlling the media tells us that you only need privacy if you're doing something wrong. So you ought to get rid of privacy unless you're doing something wrong. But I'll tell you what, in the same breath, you can read the stories that they've written about celebrities and how this person deserves some privacy, right? Or at this time, you know, there's things that have happened in my life. Some people have been visited by tragedies. You know, we would like it if you would respect our privacy, right? So how is it that if privacy has no value whatsoever, how is it that it has value in those contexts? I mean, I invite you to start to think about that when you spot the media talking about privacy in a positive way, and lodge that in your mind and think, well, wait a minute, they've been telling me over and over again that the only reason you would need privacy is if you're doing something wrong. But here's some people who aren't really doing anything wrong. They just want some privacy. You need to think about these issues because I hate to say it, but the media is trying to brainwash you by repeating these things to you over and over and over again. Like we said, a lie told often enough becomes the truth. And that's what we've got going on in so many contexts in our media.
You know what I think is scary? That China's trying to get what we have, and in this country, we're trying to stop what we have.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. Hong Kong.
It's amazing.
They're waving the American flags. They want freedom. They want privacy.
Right.
They don't want the phone to scan your face every time you have to open your phone or log into your phone or check your emails or answer a phone call. They don't want the social credit system that China has put in place with all their facial recognition cameras that ding you if you jaywalk and other things like that. I mean, and it's not just jaywalking, by the way. That's the least of it. It's having the wrong political opinion, supporting the protesters who are seeking freedom. Those are the kind of things that are going to get you not able to fly on an airplane, not able to buy a train pass, and the other things that we've talked about that they've implemented in the Chinese social credit system, which is burgeoning. It's growing. Every day they add more cameras and more cameras. They're talking about having up to 1 billion cameras at some point relatively soon and we're talking facial recognition cameras to track everything you do. Now, if you remember the book 1984, which we talk about a good bit, it was absolutely prescient because in everybody's house they had a television. You may not have read it, but this is, I mean, it is so prescient. And the television was two-way. So you think you're watching TV, meanwhile it's brainwashing you and programming you. But also the television had a camera and a microphone. And so the overlords, and at that time they weren't thinking, George Orwell wasn't thinking advanced enough to make it a computer overlord, an AI, an algorithm that's monitoring you. So back then they had actual people who could turn your TV on and look in at what you're doing and see if you're being a loyal citizen, you know, if maybe you're not, you know, maybe look at his eyes. Maybe he doesn't really believe, you know, what he's repeating, because they would have these sort of, you know, nationwide things that they would do that would bind everybody together in a certain thought process. And if you haven't read the book, you got to read it. It's fascinating
2020
stuff.
might be right around the corner, but it sure feels like 1984.
Exactly, Pat George. And so, you know, we would, in our opinion, or at least in my opinion, as the show likes to tell you, these are just my opinions, but in my opinion, it's a bad thing, and I don't want to go there. I don't know that we can stop the behemoth that's coming, and unfortunately, our media is so good at brainwashing us that we're actually asking for this stuff. Like you said, Pat George, we're not smart enough to see the parallels between what we're asking to be implemented here and what the protesters in Hong Kong are fighting against over there. It's the same thing, and you need to decide if you want to be one day one of those protesters, because that'll be your only way out if you even have that luxury. But all right, so let's switch over and talk a little bit about Ukraine, because, you know, this plays into all of this stuff. This is the basis for the impeachment. If you read Adam Schiff's impeachment report, and I skimmed it, all I needed to do was read the table of contents, frankly. But I skimmed it, and I saw just so much nonsense and gobbledygook in the table of contents itself. I mean, it looks like it was written by a high school student in terms of the tone. In my opinion, very immature tone. And Adam Schiff is kind of known for that. But let's look back into the Ukraine itself, because I tell you what, One American News Network has done some great investigative reporting, and they sent over their reporter, Chanel Rion, over there, and she interviewed a number of Ukrainian officials and past officials, and they've been running those interviews. And I want to see if we could share some of that with you, because in one of them, she interviewed Viktor Shokin, and he said that Americans need to demand the telephone transcripts of Joe Biden and Ukrainian President Poroshenko between December of 2015 and February of 2016. And if you remember, that was exactly at the time when Biden went over there and said, look, if you don't fire the prosecutor, you're not getting the $1 billion. Remember that clip? We've played it for you on the show before. If you don't fire the prosecutor, you're not getting the $1 billion. Well, why did he want the prosecutor fired? Because according to Shokin, he was absolutely outraged that Shokin was seizing the assets of that company, Burisma. You know, the one that employed his son, Hunter Biden, the one that was paying his son, Hunter Biden, protection money at $83,000 a month, which to hear Hunter Biden in Arkansas court now, which he doesn't even show up for court, but the position that he's taking there when he's being sued for child support is he's broke. So he blew the $83,000 a month. And if you want to know what he blew it on,
don't go there.
You know, Pat George. Well, let me just put it to you this way. Stuff that's not worthy of blowing that kind of money on it. I mean, it's just low-end stuff. The guy is a low-end drug addict, and, you know.
Not PG stuff.
It's not PG stuff.
Wine, women, and song.
Thank you. Wine, women, and song. Nice well said, Pat George. Well said. You know, but this guy says he's broke now. I mean, if you or I was able to make $83,000 a month, you think we'd have the good sense to save a little bit of it and put a little something away, and so on and so forth. We don't want to spend too much time on Hunter Biden because we could do a whole show on his many vices. But anyway, Viktor Shokin, when he was interviewed, and we'll see if we get this clip to work. It may well not work because I had it set up and it's been waiting so long. But let's see if we can get this to play.
My conversation with Poroshenko on this, Shokin says, was in a phone call. It was after we started seizing Burisma assets in Ukraine when Poroshenko called me and said, listen, this all has to stop already. Joe Biden's temper is overflowing. This seizing of Burisma assets, said Poroshenko, was the last straw. Shokin says Poroshenko then paid him a visit in his office, asking for Shokin's resignation. Shokin responded and asked, why do I have to go? I haven't done anything wrong. I'm doing my job. This is standard procedure. We have reason to freeze Burisma assets. And Poroshenko said, Biden is angry about you freezing Burisma assets. I'll figure something out. We asked Shokin if the
Think about that. Think about that. So you talk about inserting yourself into other countries' proceedings. We're talking about high-level corruption. Why do you think Biden was so angry about that? Because the Ukraine was being used as essentially a laundry for U.S. foreign aid. And how was it being used as a laundry? Well, USAID and these big other organizations that distribute billions of dollars of U.S. aid throughout the whole world were dumping money into the Ukraine. And that money was going all different kinds of places. And then some of those places it was going, which may include Burisma, were then hiring people from the U.S. who were connected to the ruling regime, right? Like the son of the vice president, who was President Obama's point man for the entire country. The vice president's son gets hired with no experience in energy, no experience in gas, no experience in the Ukraine. I mean, no qualifications whatsoever for the job. And he gets hired at $83,000 a month, gets paid something like a total of $3 million. What was that money for? That was protection money back to the ruling regime, and that money originated most likely in the United States through our foreign aid largesse that we visit on these countries like Ukraine. And this is one example of which I am certain there are many, many more examples. Think about when the same president, Poroshenko, in December of 2016, he awarded the Order of Freedom to John McCain. We know who else was there? Lindsey Graham. Lindsey Graham got the Order of Prince Yaroslav the Wise. You know who else was at that meeting? Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch. All three there meeting with the president. Now, why do you think that was? What do you think they had to do with Ukraine? And why do you think Lindsey Graham doesn't want to look into anybody's phone records?
We're back on the Morgan Streetman Show, and you've broken it down for me personally, Morgan, in relation to the Ukraine, clearer than what I can get on most news organizations and stations.
Well, I don't think they're designed to make it clear to you. I don't think they want you to figure out what the real story is here, right? Where the real corruption is, because it lies at the feet of Joe Biden and others. That's the issue. It's what we call the uniparty, which is like the Democrats and the Republicans united against the American people. And that is the basis of the whole President Trump phenomenon. And the MAGA movement, the Make America Great Again movement that he had, is people are sick of that. They're sick of the uniparty. They're sick of the entrenched financial interests that reside in Washington, D.C. and govern the rest of the country like it's their own personal fiefdom. And they do what they want. They ship billions of dollars over to Ukraine. That money gets laundered back to them in, parcels. I mean, they don't get all of it back, obviously. There's plenty of it that stays in the Ukraine, but enough gets back to them. I mean, you got to ask yourself, where do people like Barack and Michelle Obama, who, by the way, really didn't do much before they became, the leaders of this country, or President Obama did. I mean, okay, so he was a senator for a little while. You don't make a ton of money as a senator, right? He was a state senator. You don't make much of anything as a state senator. And before that, he was a community organizer. You think you make money as a community organizer? Absolutely not.
Yeah, but you really can't do any of this, because when the dust settles, it's going to be Biden.
Well, it's going to be Biden, but I'm just saying,
you can't
where did the Obamas get the money for the $11.75 million home in Martha's Vineyard?
I was wondering that myself.
Oh, his book deal. You got to understand, it was his book deal where they paid him $65 million. Well, yeah, and the parent company, which paid him the $65 million, is also the one that got the contract to produce the Common Core textbooks. They got the contract to produce 80% of the Common Core textbooks. Now,
because even if it's that good of a book, not that many people read anymore.
I mean, come on. You just think about it. $65 million worth? I don't think so. That, I would say, is a little bit overpaid for that book deal. Now, could there have been something else involved? Well, those are the questions that are being raised right now. That's what we're asking about, and that's what we're seeing involved over in the Ukraine. Now, I wanted to tell you, because then we want to move on and just get to our out there as well, which we do have a little out there for you, but this one's pretty out there. But before we do that, some of this stuff is pretty out there, too. But you got to go out there and watch some of these One American News Network interviews that Chanel Rion did, because she did a great job with them. And another person that she interviewed, we've talked about Victor Shokin. And by the way, on our YouTube page, some people have come forward and, Victor Shokin was totally corrupt, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You don't know what you're talking about. Well, you know what? Give us some evidence. Instead of just repeating things that you read in the liberal media who are trying to brainwash us, who just say it as a matter of fact, as though it's a conclusion with no support. Give us the evidence of him being corrupt. But I tell you what, why don't we look at another one? How about Ukrainian Prosecutor General Yuri Lutsenko, one of the guys who followed Victor Shokin up, right? Because you know what? He's also interviewed by One American News Network. And as he reports, and I don't think I'm going to run the clip because we're kind of running out of time, and we do want to get to our out there, but I'll tell you what he reports. He reports that Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch, remember her? We've talked about her already in the show, but remember, she was one of the witnesses in the impeachment proceedings. That she and George Kent, another one of the witnesses in the impeachment proceedings. Remember, George Kent, he testified with Bill Taylor, and Bill Taylor's the guy at the State Department who would not allow the visas to be approved for the Ukrainian whistleblowers who wanted to come over and tell us some of the corruption and what's going on in the Ukraine. Well, Yuri Lutsenko, Ukrainian Prosecutor General, said that Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch and George Kent basically came to his office to begin discussing with him the idea of not investigating certain people and certain companies. And he recounts one meeting, actually, with Marie Yovanovitch where she came personally to his office, and he actually began writing names down on a piece of paper. And he said, okay, so these are the list of names of people you do not want me to investigate or prosecute, because she was telling him, look, you've got to shut these investigations down. You can't investigate the following people. These people are hands off. Okay, they belong to the ruling elite. They belong. These are the agents of the uniparty that we're talking about. Don't you dare investigate them. These are the people who are doing exactly what we want them to do. And Yuri Lutsenko, the prosecutor general, he wrote these names down on a piece of paper and he held it up to her and he showed her. He says, okay, so this is the list of people you do not want me to investigate. And he said he then took the piece of paper and tore it in half and tore it in half again and tore it in half again and tore it in half again. And he said, this will never happen in my office. I will not accept you telling me who I can and cannot investigate or who I should and should not look into. But think about what's going on here, folks. This is corruption at the highest levels, and these are the same players, these highly corrupted people who are moving this money around, who don't want you to find out that Joe Biden's family was being paid off for protection money in the Ukraine. These are the same people coming over here and testifying about how corrupt President Trump is in his dealings with the Ukraine and why he ought to be impeached. I mean, that is, to use a phrase from Joe Biden, that is such a bunch of malarkey. It's hard to even fathom. I mean, these people are completely shameless, and they think you are completely stupid. But I don't think you are stupid. I think you're seeing through this, and that's why impeachment is not popular. People want this to end. They would like the Democrats in Congress and others to actually do something. Now,
we have 2 minutes to go out there?
We got 2 minutes to go out there. But
natural disaster out there.
We don't need a lot of time for this one. Because, we all like to go on tours and things. And we go to foreign countries if we have the money and we can do this. And we like to tour things. And, something that people sometimes like to tour is a volcano. You can actually go walk around the crater and maybe even go down in it. That's got to be a pretty exhilarating experience, though, because you just never know what could happen. So that's exactly what happened over in New Zealand in the past couple of days. I think it was yesterday. Some folks were actually touring a volcano on an island called White Island, and they actually have a camera that takes a picture every 10 minutes of the crater. And the camera takes a picture, and you can see the picture. You can look this up on your phones or on the internet, and you can see the picture of the little tour group walking down in the middle of the volcanic crater. And then you know what? You see the next picture, and the next picture, the camera has been totally destroyed because the volcano erupted. It exploded in a huge explosion. Now, it's not that huge, but for the volcano, it was big enough. And I know for the people that were down there in the crater itself, it was big enough. There are more than 20 people who are unaccounted for in that crater, and at least 5 of them, they know for sure, were the 5 that they had in the photo walking. I don't know if they know exactly who it was, but you can see the 5 people in the little photograph from this geocam that sits on the crater and takes a picture every 10 minutes. I just want to say, wouldn't that be exhilarating? What a way to go out, Pat George. What a way to go out. Hopefully you didn't feel anything. Hopefully you just blast off to the moon. All right, folks, thanks for listening. I'm Morgan Streetman, and that's the way I see it. Thank you for listening to the Morgan Streetman Show. We hope you enjoyed what you heard, and if you did, please click like and subscribe to help us out. And remember that we recommend that you exercise your brain at least once a week.